The Navy SEAL training compound never truly slept. Even during meals, the tension lingered in the air like humidity before a storm. The mess hall was loud, crowded, and alive with movement. Metal trays clanged, boots scraped the floor, and half-finished conversations competed with nervous laughter. But beneath the noise was something every recruit understood without being told. This room was a test, not written, not announced, constant. Petty Officer Candidate Rachel Hayes entered the mess hall with measured steps, shoulders square, eyes forward. She moved like someone who had learned long ago how to disappear in plain sight. Her uniform was clean but worn, her boots scuffed from weeks of punishment. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her tray, accepted the same bland food as everyone else, and scanned for an empty seat. There were plenty of open chairs, but none that felt neutral. She chose a table near the wall, sat alone, and began eating with quiet efficiency. No phone, no wasted motion, every bite calculated. In SEAL training, time was currency, and she spent none of it casually. Around her, groups of male recruits laughed too loudly, boasting about times, distances, and pain endured. Muscles strained against sleeves. Ego filled the gaps where discipline hadn't yet settled. Many of them had arrived believing strength alone would carry them through. Some would learn otherwise. Some wouldn't last long enough to learn anything at all. Rachel felt eyes on her almost immediately. She didn't look up. Across the room, 4 recruits sat shoulder to shoulder at a long table, trays half-finished as their attention drifted. They were hard to miss, taller than most, broad-backed, loud. The kind who dominated space without realizing it. They had bonded quickly, feeding off each other's confidence, surviving the early phases with brute force and attitude. To them, the mess hall wasn't a test, it was a stage. One of them noticed Rachel first. He nudged the man beside him, tilting his chin subtly in her direction. The others followed his gaze. A woman, alone, quiet. That was all it took. They watched her for a moment, waiting for a reaction that never came. She didn't flinch, didn't stiffen, didn't acknowledge their existence. That indifference irritated them more than fear ever could. Didn't know this was co-ed boot camp, one of them muttered, just loud enough to be heard by his friends. They chuckled. Rachel continued eating. The mess hall absorbed the sound, but the energy shifted slightly. A few nearby recruits glanced over, sensing the wrong kind of attention forming. In SEAL training, everyone learned fast that disrespect had consequences, but not always immediate ones. Rachel was used to this. She had faced it in selection, in training, in silence-filled rooms where doubt sat heavier than rucksacks. She had learned early that responding emotionally was exactly what people like this wanted, so she didn't give it to them. Her calm wasn't accidental, it was earned. The 4 recruits mistook it for weakness. They leaned closer together, voices growing bolder. Another comment followed, sharper this time, still wrapped in humor, still deniable. They believed they were untouchable, protected by numbers, by strength, by the assumption that they already belonged here. They didn't notice the instructor near the far wall. They didn't notice the sudden stillness at nearby tables. They didn't notice how a few seasoned candidates stopped eating altogether. Rachel finally paused. She set her fork down slowly and took a breath, not out of anger but calculation. Her heartbeat stayed steady. Years of discipline held it there. She raised her head and looked toward the 4 recruits. The room seemed to shrink. Her gaze wasn't confrontational. It wasn't cold. It was something worse, evaluating, like she was measuring weight, distance, and options all at once. For a moment, no one spoke. Then she stood. Chairs scraped faintly as others tensed, expecting noise, escalation, drama. That wasn't what happened. Rachel picked up her tray, met the eyes of the loudest recruit, and spoke in a level tone that carried without effort. "You might want to focus more on earning your place here," she said, "and less on guessing who doesn't belong." That was it. No insult, no threat, no raised voice. She turned and walked away, tray in hand, leaving the 4 recruits staring after her, confused, amused, and entirely unaware of what they had just triggered. Across the room, an instructor exchanged a quiet look with another. The mess hall noise slowly returned. But the test had already begun. The 4 recruits didn't speak for several seconds after Rachel walked away. For a moment, the mess hall noise rushed back in around them, trays clattering, voices rising, laughter breaking the tension. Then one of them snorted and shook his head. "Did that just happen?" he said, grinning. Another laughed louder this time. Guess she's got an attitude. They went back to eating, but something had shifted. The moment replayed in their heads not because it felt threatening, but because it hadn't gone the way they expected. No embarrassment, no anger, just control. That bothered them more than they wanted to admit. The four of them had formed a tight unit early in training. Strength had brought them together, strength and shared belief. They were fast, powerful, and resilient. In the early weeks, instructors had pushed them hard, but they kept passing. Every success fed their confidence. Every nod from a cadre member felt like proof they belonged. They believed they were ahead of the curve. They talked big because it worked. In the barracks, on the runs. During evolutions, they relied on force instead of finesse, powering through obstacles others struggled with. When one of them lagged, the others dragged him along. Numbers and muscle had carried them this far. So when they saw Rachel, sitting alone, quiet, they filled in the gaps themselves. She won't last, one of them said later that night in the barracks. They're just testing some diversity thing. No one challenged the statement. It fit their worldview too neatly. They didn't know her scores. They didn't know her background. They didn't know why instructors never corrected her posture or timing. The next morning, training resumed before dawn. Cold air burned lungs as recruits lined up in formation, shadows stretching across the concrete. Rachel stood among them, face unreadable, body relaxed but ready. The four recruits stood several rows back, still buzzing from their own conversations. When the run began, they surged forward aggressively, elbows pumping, boots pounding. They liked to set the pace early, establish dominance, force others to chase. Rachel fell into stride without pushing, matching the rhythm of the group ahead of her, conserving energy. By mile 3, cracks appeared. One of the four started breathing heavier than he should have. Another tightened his shoulders, burning out early. Rachel adjusted her stride slightly, letting them pass, letting them struggle. She watched without judgment. SEAL training wasn't about winning the first mile. It was about finishing the last one. Later, during a timed obstacle course, the four recruits went all out again. They attacked every station with raw effort, climbing, dragging, hauling. Their times were good but messy, sloppy landings, missed handholds, small mistakes that added up. Rachel moved differently. She flowed, every movement deliberate, efficient, almost quiet. She didn't rush, she didn't hesitate. When she finished, she didn't celebrate. She stepped aside, breathing steady, eyes already forward. One of the four noticed. She's fast, he admitted, wiping sweat from his face. Yeah, but speed doesn't mean anything if you can't handle pressure, another replied quickly, as if correcting a dangerous thought. Pressure was coming, none of them felt it yet. Over the next few days, the four recruits kept testing boundaries, nothing overt, nothing that would draw immediate attention. Smirks, comments just under the noise, shared jokes when Rachel was nearby. She never reacted, never acknowledged them. That silence frustrated them more than any confrontation would have. What they didn't see were the instructors tracking everything. In SEAL training, patterns mattered. Attitude mattered. Respect mattered. Cadre members watched how recruits treated weakness, real or perceived. They noted who lifted teammates up and who looked for cracks to exploit. One instructor scribbled a note on his clipboard during a formation. Another exchanged a glance during a drill. The four recruits mistook this attention for approval. Rachel sensed the shift before it happened. She always did. Years of learning how pressure moved through rooms had trained her instincts. When her name appeared on a training roster beside theirs later that week, she didn't react outwardly. But she knew. This wasn't coincidence. This was correction. And somewhere between confidence and arrogance, the four recruits were about to learn the difference. The sun had barely begun to rise when the mess hall doors swung open. Steam from hot coffee and scrambled eggs hung in the air like fog on a battlefield. Most recruits were quiet, heads down, mentally preparing for the day's grueling evolutions. Rachel Hayes entered with her usual calm precision, scanning the room without pause. She moved like a shadow, efficient, unnoticed by all but those trained to see the details. Every eye that fell on her found nothing to latch onto, nothing to exploit. Except for four. The four recruits from the previous week sat at their usual table, trays half filled, muscles taut, egos still brimming from surviving early phases. They had whispered about Rachel all morning, trading stories about her calm, calculating demeanor. Her silence had become a target for their misplaced bravado. "She thinks she can just sit there, get through this, and we'll treat her like one of the guys," one of them muttered under his breath. Another smirked. "Guess we'll see if she can handle a real challenge." They leaned back in their chairs, trays rattling, scanning her with subtle aggression. In SEAL training, subtlety could be just as dangerous as confrontation, and they were testing it in all the wrong ways. Rachel noticed the glances. She didn't flinch. She didn't tighten her shoulders. Her eyes flicked over the 4 recruits once, assessing, measuring, weighing. The room around her became background noise. She didn't need to react immediately. She had the luxury of patience. But the 4 recruits had misjudged one crucial detail. Patience in SEALs was not weakness. One of them finally crossed a line. He leaned forward, voice loud enough to cut through the chatter. "Hey, Hayes," he said, sneering. "You sure you belong here? We're not exactly used to babysitting someone who eats quietly in the corner." A ripple went through the mess hall. Nearby recruits froze mid-bite. A few instructors turned their heads subtly, clipboard pens poised. Rachel kept eating, still silent, letting the words hang in the air. The comment was meant to provoke, to humiliate, to assert dominance. It had the opposite effect. Rachel set her fork down, picked up her tray with deliberate calm, and stood. All movement was smooth, controlled, measured. The mess hall seemed to contract around her. She turned to the 4 recruits, eyes locking on the loudest offender. The room went quiet, not the silence of fear, but of attention. "You might want to focus on your own performance before questioning someone else's," she said, her tone level but sharp, each word deliberate. "Everything here is earned. Every step, every decision. You haven't earned my attention, and you certainly haven't earned respect." No one expected her to speak with authority. They expected irritation or embarrassment. They expected anger. What they got was far more unsettling: precision, confidence, command. The 4 recruits laughed it off, but the laughter was nervous, uneven. One of them nudged his friend, trying to regain composure. Another stared at his tray, suddenly self-conscious. Across the room, instructors exchanged glances. They didn't intervene. In SEAL culture, punishment often came after observation. Lessons were more powerful when learned through consequence rather than immediate correction. Rachel set her tray down again, turned, and walked out of the mess hall without another word. Each step was deliberate. Every recruit who watched her leave felt the subtle weight of her presence, the invisible authority she carried without raising her voice. The 4 recruits were left with an unsettled feeling they couldn't articulate. They had thought they were testing her. They had thought they were safe. They had thought their status, strength, and numbers were enough to intimidate her. They were wrong. That day, a line had been crossed, not by Rachel, but by them. They had underestimated a woman who had already survived challenges far beyond what they could comprehend. They had ignored every unwritten rule of respect that governed SEAL training. And they didn't even realize it yet. Somewhere in the shadows of the mess hall, the instructors made notes in silence. In the days to come, the 4 recruits would face the consequences of their arrogance. But not yet. First came preparation. First came endurance. First came the understanding that in this world, every misjudgment carried weight. Rachel walked back to her room, calm, focused, unaware of how much storm she had just set in motion. The 4 recruits, however, remained at their table uneasy, trying to laugh, trying to reclaim confidence. None of it worked. The seeds of regret had been planted. And in the coming days, those seeds would grow. The following afternoon, the mess hall buzzed with a restless energy. Recruits moved through the lines with mechanical precision, trays clattering, conversations sparse. Yet a quiet tension hung over the room like smoke. Whispers drifted from table to table. Instructors had posted a voluntary performance evaluation roster, and Rachel's name had appeared alongside the 4 recruits who had misjudged her. Voluntary in name only. The 4 men saw it as an opportunity to prove dominance, to restore bruised egos. Confidence radiated from them as they elbowed each other, joking loudly about showing that girl who truly belonged. They didn't understand that in SEAL training, confidence alone could be more dangerous than fear. Rachel sat in her corner, calmly scanning the posted roster. No expression, no sign of worry. Her posture was perfect, her breathing even. She had no need to panic. This wasn't the first time her abilities had been underestimated, and she was certain it wouldn't be the last. The 4 recruits noticed her looking at the list and smirked, interpreting her calm as hesitation. "She's probably nervous," one muttered. "Yeah," another said, almost laughing. "We'll see if she survives the first 10 minutes out there." They had no idea. The instructors gathered the group shortly afterward. "This evolution will test teamwork, endurance, navigation, and decision-making under pressure," the lead instructor announced. "You will work in small teams. Outcomes will be noted. Individual failures will be recorded." No further explanation was given. No hints. The recruits were used to structured training, familiar with step-by-step drills, but this was deliberately vague. Real-world scenarios rarely gave instructions. Real-world scenarios demanded adaptation, calm under uncertainty, and leadership under fire. The four recruits exchanged confident glances. "Piece of cake," one whispered. Rachel didn't react. When the teams were assigned, Rachel found herself grouped directly with the four men who had mocked her in the mess hall. The seating was deliberate, a subtle move by instructors to observe group dynamics. This was not punishment, it was assessment. The other recruits noticed her calm demeanor, and some shifted uncomfortably. Rachel's reputation as quiet but competent had preceded her. The four men, however, assumed the opposite. They thought they could control her, dominate her, and assert themselves as leaders. The exercise began before sunrise. Darkness stretched across the training ground, and the cold bit through the thin layers of clothing. Recruits carried packs weighted with gear, weapons simulated with wooden replicas, maps clutched in gloved hands. The goal was simple to read. Move as a unit, navigate to checkpoints, complete tasks, but impossible to master without discipline. Almost immediately, the four recruits attempted to take control. They shouted orders, jostled positions, and rushed decisions. They underestimated the complexity of coordination under exhaustion. Their confidence turned into frustration as small mistakes compounded. Misread compass bearings, missed landmarks, and inefficient handoffs. Rachel said nothing. Her approach was methodical. She recalculated routes silently, adjusted load distributions without fuss, and corrected missteps with quiet precision. Every move was deliberate, efficient, and unassuming. Slowly, the four recruits began to realize they were following her lead, not the other way around. Frustration built among them, boiling into whispered arguments. One pushed ahead recklessly, another froze mid-obstacle, trying to assert authority. Rachel stayed composed, adapting in real time. She didn't dominate, she didn't boast, she simply led by example. By the midpoint of the evolution, it was clear to everyone, including the instructors, that she was the stabilizing force. The four recruits had misjudged her from the start, and now their arrogance was becoming their undoing. As they reached a dense forested section, night shadows and uneven terrain intensified the difficulty. Mist clung to the ground, making footing treacherous. One of the four slipped, nearly tumbling into a ditch. Rachel was immediately there, steadying him, repositioning the group without a word. The instructors watched from a distance, taking notes. They didn't need to intervene. The recruits' actions and inaction would speak for themselves. Rachel moved calmly, decisively, carrying the quiet authority that could not be challenged by loud words or brute force. The four men were beginning to realize that this evaluation was not about size or ego. It was about competence under pressure. By the time they reached the first checkpoint, exhaustion and frustration had replaced confidence. The lesson was already sinking in. This was no ordinary drill, and the quiet recruit they had mocked in the mess hall was quietly teaching them something they would never forget. First hours of the exercise had stripped away arrogance, leaving only clarity. Leadership and skill could not be faked. And Rachel Hayes embodied both. Dawn had long faded, but the early morning chill persisted, clinging to skin and gear alike. Mist rolled through the dense terrain as Rachel and the four recruits pressed forward, packs heavy, boots sinking into mud. The voluntary evaluation was no ordinary drill. It was designed to push the body and mind past familiar limits, and it was working. Every step demanded focus. Every misstep could cost time, energy, or even the team's cohesion. The four recruits were struggling. Confidence from the mess hall had evaporated under the weight of reality. One fell behind, gasping for breath, hands gripping knees to steady himself. Another tripped over a hidden root, sliding inches away from a sharp drop. Panic began to seep into their movements, whispers of doubt threading through the group. Rachel moved beside them without breaking stride. Her breathing was steady, calm, controlled. Every footfall was deliberate, placing weight where it would conserve energy and prevent slips. She silently guided the recruits back on course, adjusting loads and correcting mistakes without raising her voice. She didn't lecture. She didn't scold. She led. "You've got this," she murmured to one struggling recruit, steadying his shoulder as he faltered. Her words were simple, almost understated, but carried authority the four men could not ignore. For the first time, they realized something terrifying. She wasn't struggling. She wasn't just surviving. She was in complete control of herself and indirectly of them. The first challenge came in the form of a river crossing. Cold, fast-moving water forced careful foot placement, teamwork, and trust. The four recruits hesitated. Arguments erupted over who should go first, who should carry heavier packs. Momentum faltered. Time was being lost. Rachel stepped forward. She moved like she had done this 100 times before, crossing swiftly and steadying the line from the far bank. Each recruit followed her directions, hesitant at first, then more confident as she corrected each misstep with precise guidance. Where brute force had failed, strategy and calm authority prevailed. By the midpoint of the river crossing, exhaustion was evident on all faces. The four recruits were dripping with cold, muscles trembling. Mist clung to clothes, sodden weight dragging them down. Rachel had only a slight sheen of sweat, a controlled rhythm to her movements, her mind assessing, adapting, calculating every next step. Then came the first major crisis. One of the recruits slipped mid-crossing, twisting an ankle. He went down hard, the current pushing at him dangerously. Panic surged in the group. The other three froze. Rachel reacted instantly. She leaned into the water, anchoring herself against the current, and extended her hand with steady precision. "Grab me, now." The injured recruit's hand closed around hers, and with careful leverage she hauled him to safety. No shouting, no dramatics, just efficiency. Once he was secure, she directed the others in reorganizing the crossing, redistributing weight so they could continue safely. The instructors, observing from the bank, exchanged satisfied glances. This was leadership in action. The four recruits were learning a lesson that could not be taught by words alone. By the time they exited the river, the four men were humbled, fatigued, and aware that every assumption they had made about Rachel was wrong. She had not only survived, but she had controlled the situation, saving the group from potential failure. Even the strongest among them had been physically pushed to the limit, but the true lesson was more profound. Strength without discipline, without focus, without the ability to remain calm under pressure, was meaningless. Rachel's composure had carried the group where arrogance could not. As they trudged up the next incline, muscles burning, lungs heaving, the four recruits were silent. Not out of submission, they still had pride, but out of realization. Their previous misjudgment in the mess hall now seemed reckless. Rachel did not gloat. She offered no satisfaction in their discomfort. She simply moved forward, scanning the terrain, calculating each step. Her silence carried more weight than any verbal victory. Hours into the exercise, it was clear she was not merely a participant. She was the stabilizing force. She had already earned respect through action, and the four recruits, whether they liked it or not, were learning that the rules of the SEAL world were absolute. Competence outweighed ego. By the time they reached the first checkpoint, every member of the group was physically exhausted. Every breath burned. Every muscle screamed. And yet there was clarity. A lesson had been cemented not in words, but in the relentless rhythm of effort and survival. The four recruits had underestimated her. Now they understood. She wasn't just surviving, she was leading. And they were following. By mid-afternoon, the sun hung low, filtered through a thick canopy of pines. Sweat clung to faces, packs weighed heavy on aching shoulders, and every step demanded raw willpower. The SEAL evaluation exercise had stripped away bravado, leaving only grit, exhaustion, and the truth of each recruit's limits. For the four men who had mocked Rachel Hayes in the mess hall, reality had become a harsh and unrelenting teacher. The terrain grew treacherous, muddy slopes, hidden roots, and uneven rock formations. Every misstep carried consequences, and the group's cohesion was being tested as fiercely as their physical endurance. One of the four, muscles trembling from exhaustion, froze mid-step at a narrow ledge. Fear flickered in his eyes, not just of falling, but of failure. Rachel assessed the situation instantly. She didn't yell, she didn't panic. She moved forward with deliberate precision, anchoring herself against the uneven ground and extending a hand. "Take my step, trust me," she said calmly. Her voice carried authority without arrogance, reassurance without pity. The recruit grasped her hand, and she guided him across the ledge with minimal movement, her knowledge of weight distribution, and terrain saving both time and energy. For the first time, the other three recruits watched her not as a peer, not as an anomaly, but as a true leader. But the exercise wasn't done testing them. Minutes later, another recruit misjudged a jump across a shallow creek and nearly twisted an ankle. Panic spread like wildfire. The remaining two began arguing about the best way to proceed, voices rising, nerves fraying. Rachel stepped into the center of the chaos. Without raising her voice, she directed their movements, redistributing packs, assigning tasks, and correcting mistakes instantly. Focus! One step at a time, stop talking, start moving. Her words were concise, precise, and final. The four recruits obeyed, not because of fear, but because instinct told them she was right. For the first time, arrogance had no place in their calculations. Every mistake they had made earlier, every joke in the mess hall, every misjudged glance now seemed naive, even dangerous. Exhaustion began to bite harder. Muscles screamed, lungs burned, and morale wavered. One recruit, too proud to admit weakness, tried to push forward on a twisted ankle. Another froze mid-step, unable to find the next foothold on slippery rocks. Rachel acted instantly. She redistributed weight, adjusted pace, and literally guided their bodies without hesitation, ensuring they could continue without disaster. It wasn't just physical leadership. It was mental, moral, strategic. She forced them to confront the fact that individual ego, arrogance, and misplaced confidence could jeopardize the entire team. In SEAL training, failure wasn't just personal, it affected everyone. By late afternoon, the four recruits were humbled. They had hit their physical limits, but the breaking point wasn't just exhaustion, it was realization. They had misjudged a teammate because of assumptions, gender, and misplaced pride. They had failed to understand the silent power of focus, calm, and competence. Rachel hadn't only survived their scrutiny, she had dominated under pressure. One of the recruits, gasping for breath, finally whispered, almost inaudible, I didn't expect her to handle all this." Another added voice trembling, "We underestimated her, big time." Rachel didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her actions had already spoken louder than words could. Every decision, every movement, every calm correction had left an impression more permanent than any lecture could. The final test of the day arrived as they approached a steep incline leading to the last checkpoint. Their energy was almost depleted, yet the terrain demanded coordination and careful navigation. The four recruits stumbled, arguing briefly over the safest path. Rachel moved to the front, calmly assessing each route. She signaled, directed, and adjusted their positions silently. Every step she took was precise, every motion calculated to conserve energy and prevent injury. By the time they reached the checkpoint, exhaustion was universal, but so was clarity. The four recruits were physically beaten, mentally humbled, and morally awakened. They had learned the hard way that in the SEAL world, leadership was earned, respect was earned, and assumptions were dangerous. Rachel stepped back, letting them catch their breath, her own face calm but composed. The exercise had ended in action, not words. She had not only survived under extreme pressure but had guided the group safely through chaos. The four recruits had no choice but to recognize her competence, even if pride made it difficult to admit aloud. For the first time, the lesson from the mess hall, the quiet strength they had mocked, was undeniable. They hadn't just picked the wrong girl. They had underestimated a leader, and the consequences had been immediate, exhausting, and unforgettable. In silence, they began to understand what it meant to follow someone who earned respect through action, not bravado. That realization, sharp and humbling, would stay with them far longer than any physical pain from the day. The late afternoon sun had begun its descent, painting the tree line with long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the rugged terrain. Every recruit was drenched in sweat, their clothes clinging, muscles screaming with fatigue. Packs felt like boulders on their backs, and yet the final phase of the evaluation awaited. A simulated extraction operation, designed to test endurance, trust, and leadership under extreme pressure. Rachel led the group, her movements precise and purposeful. The four recruits who had mocked her just days ago in the mess hall lagged behind in a mix of exhaustion and reluctant awe. Every misstep they had made earlier still weighed on their confidence, and the reality of their vulnerability was sinking in. The instructors had set the scenario deliberately. One injured teammate was placed mid-route, signaling that the team would have to act under stress. The terrain was unforgiving, steep ridges, hidden roots, and jagged rocks threatened to unbalance even the most cautious. Mist hung in low patches, obscuring vision and making navigation more difficult. The 4 recruits' previous arrogance offered no help here. The first test came immediately. The injured teammate lay on a narrow ledge, unable to move without risk. The 4 recruits froze instinctively. Their hands shook, boots slipping, breaths shallow and uneven. The instinct to argue or take control bubbled to the surface, but Rachel's calm authority shut it down instantly. "Step back," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with absolute clarity. "Follow my lead, one at a time, stop guessing, trust me." The recruits had no choice but to obey. They followed her instructions as she anchored herself on the slope, distributing weight and guiding the team. She stabilized the injured recruit, coordinated a carry method, and directed safe paths across treacherous footing, all without raising her voice or panicking. Each movement was calculated, precise, a masterclass in control and calm under extreme pressure. The instructors, watching from a safe distance, silently nodded. This was leadership at its rawest, most effective. Rachel had taken the chaos and turned it into a controlled operation. The 4 recruits, once so sure of themselves, were finally beginning to grasp what true leadership looked like. But the final challenge had yet to hit. As the group approached a shallow river, heavy rainfall earlier in the day had caused unexpected currents. One misstep could mean slipping into water that threatened to soak gear and add more exhaustion. The 4 recruits hesitated, panic flashing in their eyes. Rachel assessed quickly, noting every detail. "Anchor yourselves on rocks," she instructed calmly, positioning each recruit for maximum stability. She demonstrated the proper crossing, timing each step, redistributing the weight, and moving with fluid efficiency. They followed. One misjudged a step, lost balance, and nearly fell. Rachel was immediately there, steadying him, correcting posture, keeping the rhythm intact. It was relentless. The 4 recruits could no longer rely on sheer strength or ego. Every move required focus, teamwork, and trust. Each stumble reinforced the lesson they had been slowly learning. Rachel was not just surviving the exercise, she was commanding it, and the price of misjudgment had become painfully clear. By the time they emerged from the riverbank, mud-soaked and fatigued, the sun was dipping behind the tree line. Darkness would soon fall, adding yet another layer of challenge. Every muscle ached, yet there was clarity. The 4 recruits had reached the limits of their physical and mental endurance, and the final lesson had been hammered in by repeated observation. Leadership is earned through competence, calm, and the ability to guide others under pressure. As they neared the extraction point, Rachel paused briefly, letting the group catch their breath. She didn't lecture, she didn't brag. She simply observed, scanning the terrain, noting every movement, every misstep, every recovered stumble. The 4 recruits looked at her differently now, respect replacing arrogance, humility replacing ego. One of them finally muttered, almost quietly, "We underestimated her." The truth hung in the air. No one could deny it, not the instructors, not the recruits themselves. Rachel had carried them through chaos they had created with their own arrogance. She had not only survived under pressure, but had saved the team repeatedly, without drama or display. The final checkpoint loomed ahead. With one coordinated push, Rachel led the exhausted group to the target area. The instructors signaled the end. The 4 recruits stood in stunned silence, soaked, tired, humiliated, not by physical exhaustion alone, but by the undeniable truth of what had just occurred. They had tested the wrong person. They had mocked the wrong girl. And now, fully humbled, they understood. Rachel Hayes wasn't just a recruit, she was a leader. In the fading light, she allowed them a moment to absorb the lesson. No words were needed beyond what had already been proven in action. In SEAL training, lessons were not spoken aloud. They were experienced, endured, survived. And this one would remain with the 4 recruits forever. The day had finally ended. Darkness had settled over the training ground, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the cold, clear sky. The evaluation exercise was over, but the weight of what had transpired lingered like fog. Every recruit carried fatigue in their muscles, but the 4 who had mocked Rachel Hayes in the mess hall carried something heavier, a humbling awareness of their own arrogance. They trudged back to the barracks, boots squelching in mud, packs dragging, each step a reminder of how thoroughly they had underestimated her. They had entered the day thinking they would assert dominance, prove superiority, and restore ego bruised by her calm demeanor. Instead, they had been tested, corrected, and quietly humbled by a peer they had written off. Rachel walked beside them, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. She said nothing, allowed no gestures of triumph, no condescension. She didn't need to. The exercise itself had spoken volumes. Every action she had taken, guiding them across treacherous terrain, correcting their mistakes, saving the team from potential disaster, was a lesson in leadership, focus, and competence. The four recruits couldn't ignore it. Each step they had taken during the exercise replayed in their minds. The river crossing, the precarious ledges, the mud-choked slopes. Each moment had revealed something they had failed to recognize in the mess hall. Respect isn't demanded with words. Respect is earned through action, through discipline, and through the courage to lead when others falter. One of the recruits, the loudest of the group, finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "I didn't expect that. You handled everything." Rachel's eyes flicked toward him briefly, neutral but acknowledging. She nodded once. That was all. She didn't need to say more. Words would have diminished the lesson. Action had already etched it permanently into their understanding. The other three recruits exchanged glances. Pride still lingered, reluctant to fully admit defeat, yet there was no denying it. They had been wrong. Every joke, every smirk, every mocking glance in the mess hall now felt foolish in retrospect. They had underestimated not just a woman, but a peer, someone whose composure, intelligence, and ability to act decisively had saved them repeatedly during the most physically and mentally grueling hours of their training. In the quiet of the barracks later that night, the four recruits found themselves replaying the day over and over. They were exhausted, sore, and humiliated, but it was a valuable kind of humiliation. A lesson that could not have been taught in any classroom or through lecture. In SEAL training, the stakes were always real, and the consequences of arrogance could be immediate and brutal. Rachel, meanwhile, returned to her own routine, checking gear, maintaining her uniform, preparing for the next day. She didn't seek recognition. She didn't need it. Her performance had spoken for itself. Those who had tested her learned something far more lasting than a simple exercise. The quiet, competent, and composed are often the ones who carry the team through chaos. Weeks passed, and the memory of that day remained vivid. The four recruits who had mocked her adjusted their behavior. They spoke less, observed more, and learned to measure words and actions against results. They no longer assumed that strength or volume equaled superiority. They now understood that leadership, calm under pressure, and the ability to think clearly in extreme circumstances were what truly mattered. Every time they saw Rachel in the mess hall afterward, they noticed her quiet presence, her efficiency, her confidence. Respect replaced arrogance, and humility replaced assumptions. They didn't need to say it aloud. In SEAL training, actions had already spoken louder than words. Rachel had survived and thrived, not by being the loudest, not by asserting dominance, but by being competent, calm, and decisive when it mattered most. The four recruits had learned the hard way that underestimating her had been their greatest mistake. They had chosen poorly, and the consequences had been immediate, unforgettable, and humbling. In the world of Navy SEALs, lessons were rarely formal. They were lived, endured, and remembered. That day in the mess hall and the grueling hours of the evaluation would stay with the four recruits for the rest of their careers. They would remember that strength alone never determines respect, competence, and leadership do. And they would never again underestimate Rachel Hayes. Not her quiet demeanor, not her measured actions, not her ability to lead when others faltered. They hadn't just picked the wrong girl, they had learned a lesson that would follow them forever. In the silence of the barracks, the lesson settled in like a shadow. Respect is earned, arrogance is punished, and true leadership reveals itself under pressure. For Rachel Hayes, it was another day of doing what she had always done, leading by example, quietly, decisively, and flawlessly. And in that world, that was enough.